Great, it's wonderful to be with you today with this series on Conservatism 101, sponsored by my friends at the Leadership Institute. I'm Matthew Spalding with the Heritage Foundation. I'm going to speak to you today about what conservatism is not. In order to provide a broader context for conservatism, and by considering the rise of progressivism and liberalism in the American context, and talk about the relationships between conservatism and liberalism, them to each other and to America itself. This will provide a framework of history, political thought, and action, and put some of our abstract concepts into the reality of our particular nation. We can also begin to answer some of those questions about what is it exactly that we wish to conserve and why, and give us some reasons for the actions and arguments we make today about modern conservatism. So I want to do three things in the next 30 or so minutes. First, I want to introduce and define the concept of progressivism, where it comes from, what it means. Secondly, I want to discuss how it was developed in the United States over the course mainly of the 20th century, what it's come to mean. And third, I want to specifically talk about its relationship to conservatism and conservatism's relationship to it as a result. But let me begin, if I can, by talking a little bit about the American consensus by way of comparison. And beginning there is important because, as you might recall, in ancient history, ancient writing, Aristotle, but even Burke more recently, talk about when you want to talk about what to conserve, you talk about your particular regime as a starting point. And America is a quite remarkable nation. We speak today as if it's exceptional is the term we use, and indeed it is. Not because of what is accomplished, which is much, not because the strength of its economy, but more because its ideas, its history, its traditions, what it stands for. And that's largely to be found in two particular documents with which we're all familiar. The first, of course, is the Declaration of Independence. It says that we're all created equal, endowed with equal rights, rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Out of that arises the idea of consent. This, of course, gives rise to the second great document, the Constitution of the United States, the great architecture of our liberty. It's great inheritance of British constitutionalism. It takes powers and defines them and distributes them in particular offices of government. It secures our independence. It creates free markets by protecting our property. It protects our religious freedom. It does all those things which allow us to be self-governing. The workings of those two documents together, I would suggest, creates the American consensus, out of which arises the American dream. This idea that something unique about America gives rise to something different. We can come here and have opportunity to live freely and pursue our happiness, equal before the law. That framework creates opportunity, creativity, upward mobility that we have today. Those ideas, those concepts we receive from those documents, create the basic parameters, if you will, of American politics. They surely did for most of our history. Indeed, if you go back to the debates between whether it's Jefferson and Hamilton, or even through the Civil War, the context of those debates were within the parameters of the Declaration and the Constitution. It was about 100 years ago that there arose a new dream and a different sense of exceptionalism. And that came up under the context of what is called progressivism. It was in the years after the Civil War, there was this great sense of a need for change. We were entering the Industrial Revolution, the economy was expanding, the United States was beginning to prosper again after that great conflict. The expansion of urban society, the development of the United States as a modern regime, constant rethinking and a sense of reform necessary to get America ready for the new ages. So progressivism begins as a reform effort, initially at the state and local level, much of which was actually quite good, but it very quickly went beyond that. A number of political thinkers came to believe that the American system had failed. The old political science, as they called it, couldn't adequately address the problems of the day. The system had failed to prevent the Civil War, after all, and the constitutional government of the past was blamed for bringing upon that conflict. Indeed, they argued that America needed a wholly new way of thinking appropriate for the modern age. And so it was they looked for new foundational ideas, other models of governance outside of the United States. And in what is often the case, they went elsewhere to look for those ideas in places like England, where they studied with the British socialists, in France, and especially they went and studied in Germany. The German universities of the day offered a certain course of matriculation and PhDs for thousands of young Americans, beginning back in the 1820s, but especially in the late 1880s, 1890s, turn of the century. Most of these scholars obtained positions in the American university system. Indeed, the American university system was largely born in this era when it transferred from a smaller college model to the modern university, largely modeled on the German model. Studying in Germany, they were also largely influenced by German idealism and the thought of Hegel and his ideas of history. Based on these new concepts they learned there, these thinkers came back to America and established a new form, a new consensus, a new idea of politics in the United States. What resulted was a very broad social, cultural, political movement that was the first of its time to self-consciously think it was changing the American understanding of politics and principles. And they made these arguments based on three foundational, or should I say anti-foundational, concepts. The first was a concept of relativism. And this is the idea that there are no fundamental or established truths at all. Indeed, everything is merely relative to another thing. There are no fixed truths at all, certainly no objective or unchanging standards by which one could judge something. Everything was a personal value relative to other equally valid claims. There were only assumptions, starting points, nothing to establish your political system, especially one meant to be responsive to changing circumstances at all times. As the prominent historian Carl Becker put it once in 1922, to ask whether the claims of the philosophy of the Declaration of Independence is true or false is essentially a meaningless question. This relativist view renders meaningless the whole notions, the whole grounding of the American political tradition. By this argument, the concepts of nature, or natural law, which we'll come back to in a moment, that is, those ideas that undergirded the arguments of the Declaration, upon which are built the Constitution, had to be rejected philosophically. Notions of a natural moral order, of standards that can and should be the guide for man in politics, were considered naive and akin to mythology. The second concept, which follows from the first, is the idea of historicism. If relativism says that all concepts are relative, one to the other, there's no absolute truth to which we could judge truths or claims, historicism says that everything that is relative differs according to the history, to its time. You might have nice ideas back in the 18th century, but those are merely quaint 18th century ideas. Everything must be put into its historical context. That means that everything in the past is only relative to the past. What might be seen as suitable one century is not for another. The past is always inferior to the present, and the present, by implication, is always inferior to the future. Consider this quote from John Dewey, the progressive father of modern educational theory. Liberalism is committed to the idea of historical relativity. It knows that the content of the individual and freedom change with time, that this is as true of social change as it is of individual development from infancy to maturity. The positive counterpart of opposition to doctrinal absolutism is experimentalism. The connection between historic relativity and experimental method is intrinsic. Time signifies change. The significance of individuality with respect to social policies alters with change of the conditions in which individuals live. The earlier liberalism, by which he meant the liberalism of the older constitutionalism, in being absolute, was also unhistoric. Consider the claim that's being made. There are no absolute truths. There are no such things as self-evident truths, as it says in the Declaration. Everything changes and is merely values. Those values have to in turn be placed into historical context, which means at best they might be 18th century values. What was wrong with earlier liberalism, according to Dewey, was that by claiming to be absolute, by claiming to have a sense of what is true, they failed the new idea of historicism. The third anti-foundational concept they like to speak of, and that follows from the first, is the concept of positivism. All things are relative. They must be put into their historical context, but the new truth that the progressives studied and understood was that these things can only come from a sense of science. Only empirical knowledge could establish what truth really is, and science was driven by and brought us to an idea of positivism. Only things that are proven by empirical knowledge and science could be positively understood. You can imagine what would happen if this idea of positivism is then applied to other areas of social science. They believed that they could be applied to anything just as they had been applied to the physical world. That same approach, applied to man and society, would bring great change and improvement, not only to society, but also to man himself. Human nature was no longer fixed. It too could be changed. And here we might think of another figure that's not directly a progressive, but involved in the progressive movement, and that was Charles Darwin, whose work on the assumptions and ideas of scientific theory and the origin of man is key to how progressivism is applied in the United States. So these three anti-foundational concepts of the progressives: relativism, historicism, and positivism. No permanent truth, all changes with time, science is the answer. You can imagine what this means then for the concepts of the American founding and American constitutionalism. The American founders, of course, oftentimes use the word progress. This is not a new word. They used it in their writings to talk about their hopes for the future. The difference is that the progressive thinkers spoke about progress with a capital P. For them, progress itself, change, becomes the end. Because if all truth is relative, all truth changes with time, and science tells us what that truth might be according to empirical claims, you can imagine that truth really comes out in terms of where you're going, as opposed to establishing either where you've been or what your foundational concepts were upon which you build that progress. What it meant in practical terms was something even more problematic, because it implied the need for a complete reassessment of the American project. These new thinkers didn't understand themselves as rejecting the American founding outright, but correcting it, if you will, because if you recall, they believed it had failed in the past, and they wanted to make it new, to transform it into something completely different. If there are no permanent truths, then politics could not and should not be guided by claims of truths, whether they're fixed principles or self-evident truths. And if all ideas change and evolve, then the American political order, both in principle and practice, must also change and evolve with it. So you can begin to see these theories in all sorts of different thinkers and writers of the day. Let me just mention a few in quick passing before I focus on a couple. Herbert Crowley, he founded the New Republic magazine in 1914. He wrote a very important book, the Progressive Bible, if you will, called The Promise of American Life in 1909. Richard Ely, professor of political economy at the University of Wisconsin, really the father, if you will, of progressive economics. Walter Rauschenbusch, a Baptist minister, key figure in the social gospel movement. There was a theological aspect of progressivism as well. John Dewey, who I quoted earlier, the philosopher of American progressivism, psychologist, educational reformer, developer of the theory of pragmatism a little bit later. Popular prints, economics, theology, education. Progressivism really was all over the place. Now, it wasn't of one piece, of course. So to this list, we might also add someone like Upton Sinclair, the great muckraking novelist. Or how about the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright, or the revisionist history of Charles Beard? There were extensive ideas across society, across academics, about how these progressive ideas, these anti-foundational principles, should play out in virtually every aspect of American life.